Always helps when you unmute yourself. In the first months of 1985, I knew something was going on in my home of origin. There were a lot of conversations that were going on between my mom and my dad, and most of those conversations I could hear in muffled tones as my brother and I would go to our room, and my sister, who was but only about a year and a half old at the time, was put in her crib. I can remember that there were these conversations that were going on, and I can remember that my dad seemed somewhat tired, somewhat overwhelmed. He was a service manager at a new car dealership in Mattoon, Illinois. And so he would be driving back from Charleston to Mattoon every day to go to work. And one day on the buffet in the kitchen, I noticed this legal pad that had some grease stains upon it. And on this legal pad was a line drawn down the middle, and it said pros and cons. Now, I don't remember anything about what was on the pros side or what was on the cons side, but I learned relatively quickly that my dad was wrestling with God's call upon his life to become a pastor. My dad actually can point back to when he was 14 years old, sitting at camp, and God began to move in his heart to call him to go into ministry. But it took him 22 years to actually respond to that call. And I can remember when my dad and my mom sat down, my brother and I and my sister was there, and they told us that the house that we had lived in for all of my life, all of 9 years at that time, that we were going to move. And as I sat down with my dad recently and we were talking about this conversation, this time in our lives in 1985, he said, "Son, you may or may not remember this, but," he says, "I quit my job at the end of May of 1985. But I was not told that I was truly appointed as a pastor until about the second week of June." And I said, "Dad, what were you thinking? Are you crazy?" And as we spoke together, I began to see how my dad's model, how my dad's example has guided my life. Because you see, if you fast forward from 1985 to 1996, I was sitting at camp, when all of a sudden God moved in my heart and my life, and I knew that God was calling me to be in ministry. But when I was asked by my dad, "Is this the call?" I said, "Can't be, won't be, I will not." So I cut a deal with God. I said, "Okay, God, here's the deal. If a certain pastor calls me, I know that this is what you're calling me to do." That pastor called me within 8 hours of me making a deal with God. If this was a moral of the story, don't make deals with God. God called me and said, "I want you to be in ministry." So I changed the course of my life from being a secondary education biology teacher to becoming a pastor. Fast forward 8 years later to 2004. I'm sitting at Beulah Camp, and the song that we just sang, "Give Us Clean Hands," was sung. I said, "God, I'm not exactly where you want me to be right now, am I? You've got something more for me. Your call is bigger than just where I am. Lord, help me to be obedient. Lord, I want to lead a generation that seeks your face. That seeks your face, O God of Jacob." And that put me on a course that 4 years later, as I stand before you, I feel as though I am fully following where God is leading me and my family. But it's risky. It's risky to follow Christ. This morning you may have noticed that the title is Risky Business. And for those of you who are sitting waiting for the popcorn and Tom Cruise movie to come on, it's not happening. But following Christ is risky business. And I want us to invite us to think about that for just a moment this morning. This passage that Paul read for you out of Ruth is an amazing passage to me. Because what has happened real quick is that you have this famine that is going on in Judah, And so Naomi and her husband moved to Moab to find food. It doesn't really tell us how many other Israelite people moved there, but we can probably guess that they're not the only family that has a corner on the market. They moved to this place in Moab, and while they're there, their sons come of age to marry. Now, what is intriguing to me is that they marry Moabite women, which, if you've read much through the Old Testament, you know that God's desire is for Israelites to marry Israelites. And so it's intriguing that these two young men marry these Moabite women, but that's what they do. Naomi's husband dies. The two sons die, leaving these three widows, Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth, there in Moab. Now, somehow, Scripture doesn't really tell us, word gets to Naomi that the famine is over. God has begun to provide in Judah. Now, that's one of those questions I always wonder. How did the news get there? I mean, today we just email each other, hey, famine's over, come home. How did they do it? But somehow, they get the information that the famine is over, and Naomi gathers up her stuff, and Orpah and Ruth come with her. But at some point in this trek, Naomi stops them. Now, in my mind, I somewhat wonder if it's not at the line of Moab and Judah. I wonder if there's this sense of, okay, we are getting ready to cross a threshold here. Orpah, Ruth, thanks for traveling with me. Go back home. Go back to your people. Go back to your gods. Orpah says, okay. Her and Naomi share an embrace, a kiss, and they go their separate ways. But Ruth, the persnickety one, says, no, Naomi, do not tell me to go. For where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there they will bury me. Ruth has a couple of issues that she has to deal with in order to say those words. One is her identity. When I was in Mexico speaking a couple of years ago, they were having the Mexican presidential elections, which is an amazing, amazing thing to go through because in the United States, we do like one day. In Mexico, I can't remember if it's 10 days, 2 weeks, something like that. It is a long time in which you have the opportunity to go and vote. And when you vote, you actually stick your finger in and you get an ink stain put on your finger.